What do you do when you discover that the man who drives your children to school every day is one of the most elite warriors America has ever produced? When the gentle giant who tells jokes and settles playground disputes turns out to be someone who once conducted the most dangerous military operations in the world. The parents at Maple Elementary were about to find out. Because the SEAL Trident that fell from Ray Martinez's keychain that Tuesday morning was about to reveal a story of sacrifice, brotherhood, and a hero who had found his new mission in the most unexpected place, behind the wheel of a school bus, protecting the most precious cargo of all. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this incredible story of hidden valor and unexpected purpose, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe heroes come in all forms, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Ray Martinez arrived at the Riverside School District Transportation Depot every morning at 6:15 a.m., 45 minutes before his first pickup. While other drivers grabbed coffee and complained about early mornings, Ray performed what he privately called his mission prep, a thorough inspection of Bus 47 that would have impressed any military vehicle commander. Tires, brakes, lights, emergency exits, first aid kit, fire extinguisher, every system checked, every safety protocol verified. The district's maintenance standards were adequate, but Ray's standards were higher. He'd learned long ago that attention to detail was the difference between everyone coming home safe and catastrophic failure. At 45 years old, Ray looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a school bus driver, big enough to command respect, gentle enough to calm frightened kindergartners, with graying temples that suggested wisdom and kind eyes that inspired trust. He wore the same uniform every day, navy blue pants, light blue shirt with the district logo, and steel-toed boots that were always polished to a mirror shine. The children loved him. In 4 years of driving Route 47, Ray had never raised his voice, never lost his patience, never failed to notice when a child was having a bad day. He knew all 53 of his regular passengers by name, remembered their birthdays, asked about sick pets, and somehow managed to make a 20-minute bus ride feel like the best part of their day. 8-year-old Tommy Chen looked forward to the ride more than recess. Ray always asked about his baseball games and remembered which position he played. Kindergartner Sarah Williams, who had been terrified of the big yellow bus on her first day, now raced to claim the seat right behind Ray so she could hear his stories about talking animals and brave children. The parents trusted Ray completely. In a world where they worried constantly about their children's safety, Bus 47 felt like a sanctuary. Ray communicated with them regularly, not through formal reports, but through the kind of personal attention that meant everything to worried mothers and fathers. When Mrs. Peterson's daughter Emma broke her arm, Ray made sure she got the seat closest to the door and personally helped her with her backpack for 3 weeks. When the Rodriguez family was going through a difficult divorce, Ray quietly kept an eye on 9-year-old Miguel, making sure he ate the lunch his parents sometimes forgot to pack. What none of them knew was that Ray Martinez approached his job with the same precision and dedication he'd once brought to conducting classified military operations in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. That his hypervigilance wasn't just conscientiousness, it was the survival instinct of someone trained to expect threats from any direction. That his calm under pressure wasn't just good temperament, it was the result of 12 years serving with SEAL Team 6. Ray had been medically retired from the Navy 3 years earlier after a training accident left him with chronic knee pain and nerve damage in his left shoulder. Not career-ending injuries for most jobs, but enough to disqualify him from the physical demands of special operations. The transition to civilian life had been difficult, not financially, thanks to his pension and disability benefits, but emotionally. Men who had defined themselves by elite military service often struggled to find purpose in ordinary jobs. But driving a school bus wasn't ordinary, Ray had discovered. It was a different kind of mission, but a mission nonetheless. Every morning, parents entrusted him with their most precious possessions. Every afternoon, he was responsible for delivering those children safely home. The stakes weren't life and death in the way they'd been during his SEAL career, but they were life and death in the way that mattered most to the families who depended on him. Tuesday, October 17th, started like every other school day. Ray completed his pre-trip inspection, picked up his passengers at 14 stops along Route 47, and delivered them safely to Maple Elementary by 7:45 a.m. The afternoon run went equally smoothly until the next-to-last stop, when 8-year-old Sophie Martinez's backpack somehow came unzipped as she stood up to exit the bus. The backpack's contents scattered across the aisle: notebooks, pencils, a juice box, her favorite stuffed animal, and a small wooden puzzle her grandfather had made for her. Sophie immediately started crying, not because anything was broken, but because she was embarrassed by the mess and worried she'd be late getting off the bus. "Hey, no worries, sweetheart," Ray said gently, engaging the parking brake and standing up from the driver's seat. "Accidents happen. Let's get everything picked up." Sophie's father, Carlos Martinez, was waiting at the bus stop as always. When he saw his daughter crying and realized what had happened, he boarded the bus to help gather her scattered belongings. Ray was kneeling in the aisle, collecting pencils and reassuring Sophie that everything was fine, when his keychain, clipped to his belt loop, caught on the edge of a seat and came loose. The keys scattered across the rubber floor mat with a metallic clatter, and Carlos automatically bent down to help collect them. That's when he saw it, mixed in with the ordinary keys and district ID badge, a small metal pin unlike anything he'd ever seen outside of military documentaries. The Navy SEAL Trident, an eagle with spread wings clutching an anchor, trident, and flintlock pistol, the most recognizable symbol of America's most elite special operations force. Carlos Martinez was a high school history teacher who had spent years studying military history. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't a replica or a souvenir shop purchase. This was the real thing, worn smooth at the edges, with the authentic weight and finish of something that had been earned rather than bought. Ray noticed Carlos staring at the pin and realized his carefully maintained cover had just been blown. For a moment, neither man spoke. Sophie continued gathering her scattered belongings, oblivious to the fact that her father had just discovered something that would change how their entire school community viewed their beloved bus driver. "Is that?" Carlos began, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. Ray gently took the pin from Carlos's hand and clipped it back onto his keychain. "It's from a long time ago," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that Carlos had never heard before. "How long ago?" Carlos asked, keeping his voice low so Sophie wouldn't overhear. 12 years active duty. Retired 3 years ago." Ray's military bearing was suddenly visible in a way it had never been before. The perfect posture, the precise way he spoke, the unconscious habit of scanning their surroundings even during a casual conversation. Carlos felt his understanding of Ray Martinez shift completely. This wasn't just a kind, reliable bus driver. This was someone who had served at the highest levels of military special operations, someone whose training and experience were so far beyond ordinary civilian comprehension that Carlos couldn't even begin to imagine what Ray's service had involved. "The kids, do they know?" Carlos asked. Ray shook his head. "No one knows. I'd prefer to keep it that way." But Carlos couldn't keep it that way. Not because he wanted to gossip or violate Ray's privacy, but because he suddenly understood that their children were in the care of someone extraordinary, and that seemed like something the school community should know. That evening, Carlos Martinez found himself unable to concentrate on grading papers or helping Sophie with her homework. His mind kept returning to the moment when he'd held the sealed trident in his palm, feeling the weight of something that represented achievements he could barely comprehend. As a history teacher, Carlos understood the significance of what he'd seen. Navy SEALs weren't just elite soldiers, they were legends within the military community. The training was so demanding that approximately 80% of candidates who started SEAL training never finished. Those who did earn the Trident represented the absolute pinnacle of military special operations capability. Carlos began researching what it meant to be a Navy SEAL, particularly someone who had served with SEAL Team 6, the unit Ray had mentioned during their brief conversation. What he found made him realize that their bus driver wasn't just a former special operations soldier. He was someone who had likely participated in some of the most classified and dangerous missions in modern military history. SEAL Team 6, officially known as the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, handled the military's most sensitive operations: counterterrorism, hostage rescue, direct action missions in denied territory. The kind of operations that never appeared in newspapers because acknowledging them would compromise national security. The more Carlos learned, the more he understood why Ray had chosen to keep his background private. SEALs often struggled with the transition to civilian life, not because they couldn't handle ordinary jobs, but because ordinary jobs felt meaningless after years of life-or-death missions with global implications. But driving a school bus wasn't ordinary, Carlos realized. In Ray's mind, it was probably another kind of mission, protecting and serving, just with different objectives and different stakes. Over the next few days, Carlos found himself watching Ray differently during the afternoon pickup routine. The way Ray positioned the bus, always with clear sightlines and multiple exit routes, the way he unconsciously scanned the area around the school before opening the door, the calm authority he projected that made even the most hyperactive children settle down and follow instructions. These weren't just good driving habits or natural leadership skills. They were the reflexes of someone trained to assess threats, control situations, and prioritize the safety of others above all else. Carlos began to understand that Ray Martinez hadn't just found a job driving a school bus. He'd found a way to continue serving, to use his elite training for a mission that mattered deeply, ensuring that 53 children made it safely to and from school every single day. The following Friday afternoon, Carlos Martinez waited until all the other parents had collected their children before approaching Bus 47. Ray was completing his post-trip inspection, the same methodical process he performed every day when Carlos climbed aboard. "Mr. Martinez," Ray said, looking up from his clipboard, "everything okay with Sophie?" "Sophie's fine," Carlos replied, "but I was hoping we could talk about what I saw the other day." Ray set down his clipboard and gave Carlos his full attention. The casual friendliness was still there, but underneath it was something harder, the wariness of someone who had learned to be cautious about revealing too much about himself. "I'm a history teacher," Carlos began. "I've spent years studying military operations, reading about special forces, trying to help my students understand what service and sacrifice really mean. But I've never actually met someone who lived it at your level." Ray didn't respond immediately. When he did speak, his voice was measured, careful. "Mr. Martinez, I appreciate your interest, but that part of my life is over. I'm just a bus driver now. That's all these kids and their parents need to know." "Is it over?" Carlos asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're still serving, just in a different uniform." Ray looked out the bus windshield at the empty school parking lot, considering Carlos's words. "Those kids trust you completely," Carlos continued. "Their parents sleep better at night knowing you're the one responsible for getting their children safely to and from school. You think that's less important than what you did in the Navy?" "It's different," Ray said quietly. "Different how?" "You told me once that your job is to make sure every child on this bus gets home safely to their family. How is that different from making sure every member of your SEAL team got home safely to theirs?" Ray was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried emotion Carlos had never heard before. "In the teams we had a saying, the only easy day was yesterday. Every mission was harder than the last one, every deployment more dangerous than the previous one. You lived with the constant knowledge that you might not make it home." He paused, looking around the interior of the bus, the colorful safety posters, the worn seats where children sat every day, the small touches that made Bus 47 feel welcoming rather than institutional. "This job, it's the opposite of that. Every day is supposed to be easy, routine, safe. These kids should never have to worry about whether they'll make it home." "And they don't," Carlos said, "because you make sure they don't have to worry about that." Ray nodded slowly, beginning to understand what Carlos was trying to tell him. "The mission isn't over," Carlos continued. "It just changed. You went from protecting Americans you'd never met to protecting Americans you see every single day, from serving your country to serving your community. That's not a step down. That's evolution." For the first time since Carlos had known him, Ray Martinez smiled with something approaching pride, rather than just politeness. Word of Ray's military background spread slowly through the parent community at Maple Elementary, not as gossip, but as something approaching reverence. Carlos had been careful about how he shared the information, making sure it was conveyed with respect for Ray's privacy and preference for anonymity. The change in how parents interacted with Ray was subtle but unmistakable. They still trusted him completely with their children, but now that trust was informed by understanding of who he really was and what he'd accomplished before becoming their bus driver. Mrs. Peterson, whose daughter Emma had broken her arm, approached Ray one afternoon with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Ray," she said, "I just wanted you to know how grateful I am, not just for how you took care of Emma when she was hurt, but for everything you've done, for our country and for our children." Ray accepted her thanks with characteristic grace, but Carlos could see that the recognition meant something to him, not because his ego needed stroking, but because it validated that his current mission was valued and understood. The real transformation came from an unexpected source: the children themselves. During a routine safety drill, 6-year-old Marcus Thompson asked Ray why they practiced emergency evacuations if nothing bad was ever going to happen on their bus. "Well," Ray said, kneeling down to Marcus's eye level, "sometimes things happen that we don't expect, but if we practice what to do, we'll be ready to handle them calmly and safely." "Like how soldiers practice for battles?" Marcus asked. Ray paused, realizing that someone had told Marcus about his military background. "Yes," Ray said simply. "Exactly like that. Soldiers practice so they can take care of each other when things get dangerous. We practice so I can take care of all of you if something unexpected happens." "Were you a really good soldier?" asked Sophie Martinez, who had moved to the front of the group. Ray looked around at the circle of young faces, all watching him with the kind of attention children usually reserved for superhero movies. "I tried to be," he said, "just like I try to be a really good bus driver now." "What's the most important thing about being a soldier?" asked Tommy Chen. Ray considered the question carefully. These children deserved an honest answer, but one they could understand and apply to their own lives. "Taking care of the people on your team," he said finally, "making sure everyone gets home safely. That's what soldiers do, and that's what we do on this bus. We take care of each other." The children nodded solemnly, as if they'd just been entrusted with important information. "Mr. Ray," asked 8-year-old Sarah Williams, "do you miss being a soldier?" Ray looked around Bus 47, at the children who depended on him, at the parents who trusted him, at the community that had welcomed him without question or judgment. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but I like taking care of all of you. It's a different kind of mission, but it's just as important." 3 months after Carlos Martinez discovered Ray's SEAL background, Maple Elementary's principal, Dr. Linda Foster, called Ray into her office. He expected a routine meeting about bus schedules or safety protocols. Instead, he found Dr. Foster with a folder of letters from parents and a proposal that would change his role at the school. "Mr. Martinez," Dr. Foster began, "I've been receiving letters from parents about you. Not complaints, quite the opposite. They're telling me about your military background, about how you've been taking care of their children, about the level of security and professionalism you bring to what many people consider just a transportation job." Ray shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Several parents have suggested that we ask you to speak to our students about service, leadership, and responsibility, not about combat or military operations, but about what it means to serve something bigger than yourself." Dr. Foster opened the folder and showed Ray some of the letters. Parents describing how their children had started taking the emergency procedures more seriously after learning about Ray's background. Teachers noting improved behavior and respect for authority among Bus 47 passengers. Comments about how the children seemed to understand, in an age-appropriate way, that their bus driver was someone special who deserved their respect and attention. "I'm not asking you to become a recruitment officer or to glorify military service," Dr. Foster continued, "but these children are learning important lessons from you about duty, responsibility, and taking care of others. Would you consider formalizing that education?" Ray thought about the question for several minutes. The idea of speaking publicly about his military experience made him uncomfortable, not because he was ashamed of his service, but because he'd worked hard to build a civilian identity separate from his SEAL background. But he also thought about Marcus Thompson asking why they practiced emergency drills, about Sophie Martinez wanting to know what made a good soldier, about Tommy Chen's serious nod when Ray had explained that their job was to take care of each other. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ray asked. "Once a month, maybe 30 minutes with different grade levels. Talk about teamwork, leadership, responsibility. Help them understand that service comes in many forms: military service, community service, even being a good classmate or family member." Ray realized that Dr. Foster was offering him something he hadn't expected to find in civilian life: the opportunity to mentor the next generation, to pass on the values that military service had taught him, to continue serving in a way that felt meaningful and important. "I'll do it," he said, "but I want to focus on the children understanding that they can serve others right now in their daily lives. They don't have to wait until they're adults to make a difference." Dr. Foster smiled. "I think that's exactly what they need to hear." 2 years later, Ray Martinez was still driving Bus 47, but his role at Maple Elementary had expanded far beyond transportation. His monthly talks with students had become one of the school's most popular programs, not because he told exciting war stories, but because he helped children understand that heroism was about daily choices rather than dramatic moments. The children on Bus 47 had developed a reputation throughout the district for their behavior, their respect for others, and their understanding of what it meant to be part of a team. They'd learned these lessons not through lectures or disciplinary programs, but by spending time with someone who embodied the values he taught. Ray's influence extended beyond the students. Several parents had started volunteering more actively in their community after conversations with Ray about different ways to serve. Teachers had noticed improvements in classroom behavior among students who rode Bus 47. Even other bus drivers had begun adopting some of Ray's practices and attitudes, but perhaps the most significant change was in Ray himself. The transition to civilian life that had been so difficult for the first year after his retirement had become something he embraced fully. He'd found a way to continue serving that felt natural and important, a mission that used his training and experience in ways that benefited his community. On quiet mornings, before the children boarded Bus 47, Ray would sometimes think about his SEAL teammates, men who had shared dangers and hardships that most people couldn't imagine. Some had died in service to their country. Others had struggled with their own transitions to civilian life. Ray felt a responsibility to honor their memory by living well, by serving well, by proving that the values they'd all learned in the military could make a difference in everyday civilian life. The SEAL Trident still rode on his keychain, no longer hidden but not displayed prominently either. It was a reminder of who he had been and what he had learned, but it wasn't the most important thing about him anymore. The most important thing was the 53 children who trusted him to get them safely to school every morning and safely home every afternoon. Carlos Martinez, the history teacher who had first discovered Ray's secret, watched his daughter Sophie board Bus 47 every morning with complete confidence in her safety. But more than that, he watched her learn lessons about service, leadership, and responsibility from someone who had lived those values at the highest level. "Dad," Sophie had told him recently, "Mr. Ray says that heroes are just regular people who choose to take care of others. He says I can be a hero too, just by being kind and helping my classmates." Carlos had smiled, understanding that his daughter was learning something more valuable than any curriculum could teach, that service was about daily choices, that leadership was about taking care of others, and that real heroes often drove school buses and wore navy blue uniforms instead of dress uniforms and medals. Ray Martinez had served his country with distinction in some of the most elite military units in the world, but his most important mission might have been teaching 53 children and their parents that service continues long after the uniform comes off, and that protecting others is a calling that can be answered in many different ways. Some warriors carry weapons, others carry lunchboxes and first aid kits, but they all share the same fundamental mission: making sure everyone gets home safely at the end of the day. This story was brought to you by Daily Soldier Stories. Have you ever discovered that someone ordinary was carrying extraordinary stories? Share their name in the comments, and if this story reminded you that heroes come in all forms, subscribe to support the channel. Sometimes the most important missions are the ones we never hear about.